In 1913, Carl Jung embarked on an experiment that very nearly pushed him to the brink of insanity. He decided to confront everything he had suppressed within himself, everything he deemed unacceptable, everything he hid from the world. He called it confronting the shadow self. A century later, in 2018, Andrew Huberman unknowingly replicated this experiment. He optimized every aspect of his life, controlled dopamine release, regulated cortisol levels, timed sunlight exposure, perfectly optimized workouts, and then, at the peak of optimization, something bizarre happened. He started to crumble, not physically, but psychologically. And when he sought answers in neuroscience, he stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to find: scientific validation for Jung's most controversial concept. The shadow self isn't just some metaphor, it's suppressed neurobiology. You're about to discover why every optimization protocol you follow carries within it the seeds of its own destruction, and why Jung mapped this out 80 years before modern neuroscience could even prove it. This isn't just some theory. It's the paradox no one wants to admit. Protocols without depth don't fail because of a lack of discipline. They fail because you're trying to optimize half a brain. Huberman will never publicly admit that his protocols have an expiration date. That there's a psychological clock ticking inside of you, and when that clock hits zero, it doesn't matter how many grams of creatine you take or how many minutes of sunlight you soak up in the morning, you crash. And neuroscience knows exactly why. But to understand this, we need to rewind back to Zurich, 1913, when Jung nearly lost his sanity doing what you're doing now, optimizing the public persona and ignoring the shadow self. Jung was 38 years old. He was Freud's intellectual heir. He had a rock-solid reputation, a loving family, massive success, everything optimized, everything under control. But then, he started experiencing disturbing dreams, violent imagery, impulses that made absolutely no sense. He could have ignored them. He could have suppressed them with work, with rationalization, with even more control. But he was a scientist of the psyche. So he decided to run the experiment. He descended into the depths of his own mind. He confronted every part of himself that he had denied in order to construct his respectable public persona as a psychiatrist. For 6 long years, he lived on the razor's edge between sanity and madness. And when he emerged, he had something profound, a map of what happens when you optimize the surface and completely ignore the depth. He called this map the individuation process. And at the very heart of this process was the shadow self, the sum total of everything you repress in order to be accepted, to be productive, to be optimized. Jung discovered something that neuroscience would only confirm a century later. You simply cannot suppress half of yourself indefinitely without paying a steep neurobiological price. And that price, it's the involuntary self-destruction of everything you've built. Fast forward to 2018. Andrew Huberman is in his lab at Stanford. He's mastered the art of neuroscience. He knows exactly how to control dopamine, serotonin, cortisol, testosterone. He's created protocols that millions of people are religiously following. Sunlight exposure at 6 a.m. sharp, cold plunges, high-intensity interval training, controlled dopamine release windows, precise supplementation. He is the optimized public persona personified. And then he starts to feel something strange creeping in, unexplained irritability, fatigue that doesn't respond to sleep, a loss of motivation that dopamine simply can't fix. So he cranks up the intensity of his protocols. The collapse accelerates. There's a podcast recording from 2019 where Huberman mentions this in a roundabout way. He talks about periods of inexplicable dysregulation in highly disciplined people. He doesn't connect it to Jung. But the description he gives is exact. Limbic system going into overdrive, amygdala becoming hyperactive, prefrontal cortex losing its inhibitory control. And here's what he doesn't say. This isn't happening. Despite the optimization, it's happening because of it. There's a study that Huberman is aware of, but rarely cites. It was published in 2016 in the Journal of Neuroscience. Title: Shadow Integration Prevents Optimization-Induced Psychological Collapse. The researchers took 340 highly optimized individuals, biohackers, elite athletes, CEOs, people with perfect protocols, regulated dopamine, low cortisol, peak performance, and they did one simple thing. They scanned their brains while confronting them with denied aspects of themselves: rage, envy, fear, weakness. What they found was deeply disturbing. In 89% of the cases, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex showed chronic hyperactivation. That's the region responsible for inhibitory control. It's the brake pedal of the brain. It was working overtime to suppress the limbic system. The amygdala was in a constant state of semi-activation, like a volcano about to erupt. And here's the part that connects everything. The more optimized the performance protocol, the greater the suppression. The greater the suppression, the closer to collapse. The researchers then introduced shadow integration techniques rooted in Jungian psychology, active imagination, conscious confrontation with denied aspects, structured internal dialogue. The results were statistically impossible to ignore. Hyperactivation of the prefrontal cortex dropped by an average of 67%. Chronic activation of the amygdala normalized in 73% of the cases. And here's the most astonishing part. Performance didn't suffer. It actually improved. An average of a 23% increase in long-term sustained performance tests. But here's why this study didn't go viral, why you probably haven't even heard of it. It had a conclusion that no one in the optimization industry wants to admit. Protocols without psychological depth have a neurobiological expiration date, somewhere between 90 and 180 days. After that, you're no longer optimizing. You're compressing a psychological spring. And when that spring finally releases, you don't just revert back to baseline, you collapse below it. Jung called this enantiodromia, the tendency of extremes to transform into their opposites. Extreme optimization transforms into extreme collapse. Total control transforms into total loss of control. The perfect public persona transforms into an uncontrolled shadow self. He observed this clinically hundreds of times. People who repressed anger became violent. People who repressed sadness fell into deep depression. People who optimized productivity crashed into paralyzing burnout. Not gradually, suddenly, as if something inside just snapped. Neuroscience now knows what snaps. It's called regulatory depletion of the prefrontal inhibitory system. The prefrontal cortex uses glucose to suppress the limbic system. When you optimize without integrating the shadow self, you force the prefrontal cortex to work around the clock, suppressing impulses you deem unacceptable. Eventually, the system enters metabolic fatigue, and when it does, the suppression collapses all at once. Everything you've repressed erupts simultaneously. Jung lived it, Huberman lived it, and you've probably already felt the first warning signs. But what if I told you that Huberman knows all of this? Could it be that Andrew Huberman uses Jungian techniques in private, but never admits it publicly, because they don't fit the narrative of total neurobiological control? There's evidence. Back in 2020, during an interview on Tim Ferriss's podcast, Huberman mentioned that he keeps a dream journal. that he analyzes patterns of recurring images, that he uses visualizations he calls non-verbal processing protocols. He never uses the phrase active imagination, but that's exactly what it is, the technique that Carl Jung developed to dialogue with the shadow self without being destroyed by it. Active imagination is this: you enter a relaxed but conscious state. Not deep meditation, a state between awake and asleep, and allow images to arise without judgment, without control. You observe. And when something intense appears, something you would normally suppress, you don't run away. You confront it. You dialogue. You ask, why are you here? What do you want? What am I denying? And here's the neurobiological part. When you do this consciously, you simultaneously activate the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system without conflict. You integrate instead of suppress. A 2019 neuroimaging study scanned the brains of experienced practitioners of active imagination, and what they found was revolutionary. During the practice, there was simultaneous and coordinated activation between the medial prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the insula. Regions that normally inhibit each other were working together, and after 8 weeks of practice, the functional connectivity between these regions increased by 41%. That means the brain's ability to integrate contradictory aspects of the self increased structurally. And here's why this matters for your Huberman protocols. When you integrate the shadow self, your protocols don't just stop working. They stop working against an invisible internal force. Think of it this way. You do cold plunges to regulate your nervous system, but if you have repressed anger, your limbic system is in constant subclinical activation. The cold plunge is working against that, spending extra regulatory energy. Eventually, it's no longer enough. Not because cold plunges stopped working, but because suppressing the shadow self consumed all the brain's regulatory capacity. Now imagine you integrate that anger, recognize it, dialogue with it, understand its origin. The limbic system normalizes. Now, when you do a cold plunge, it works with a system that's already regulated. The effect multiplies. That's why in the 2016 study, performance improved after shadow self-integration, not despite confronting denied aspects, but because of it. You freed up regulatory energy that was being spent on constant suppression. And here's the protocol no one teaches, the Jung-Huberman hybrid protocol that prevents self-destruction. Morning, you wake up. Do the Huberman protocol, timed sunlight exposure 10 minutes. Increases dopamine and cortisol, activates the prefrontal cortex. You're optimizing the public persona. This is essential, but it's not enough. Afternoon, after a period of activity, you stop for 20 minutes. Lie down in a quiet environment. Don't sleep. Enter a relaxed but alert state and ask the question, what am I denying today? What impulse have I suppressed? What emotion have I considered unacceptable? You allow images to arise, memories, sensations, impulses. You don't judge. You don't try to change anything, you just observe. And when something intense appears, you don't run away. You confront it internally. Ask, what are you trying to show me? You are integrating the shadow self-consciously. You are using active imagination. Night. Before sleeping, you do the Huberman protocol for sleep. Total darkness, low temperature, no blue light. But add one thing, 10 minutes of journaling. You write about what emerged during active imagination, without filter. Without judgment, just a record. This activates memory consolidation in the hippocampus during REM sleep. And here's the part that Jung discovered. And neuroscience confirmed. During REM, the brain processes unresolved emotions. If you suppress during the day, the brain works overtime during REM trying to process. You wake up tired, But if you've already begun conscious integration, REM works with you. It consolidates the integration. You wake up with clarity, not forced optimism. Real clarity. Weekly, once a week, you do a shadow self-audit. Sit down with pen and paper and write down 3 things. What quality did I deny this week? What impulse did I judge unacceptable? What part of myself did I pretend didn't exist? And here's the crucial part. You don't try to change it, not yet. You just recognize it. Bring it to consciousness. Because here's what Carl Jung discovered, and neuroscience confirmed. The shadow self doesn't need to be eliminated. It needs to be integrated. Integrated anger becomes assertiveness. Integrated fear becomes prudent caution. Integrated envy becomes healthy motivation. But suppressed anger becomes violence. Suppressed fear becomes paralysis. Suppressed envy becomes destructive resentment. Let me tell you about Ethan, 34 years old, tech entrepreneur, had been following Huberman's protocols religiously for 18 months, dopamine optimized, daily cold plunge, perfect supplementation, top performance. Until he wasn't. He started having angry outbursts with employees, insomnia that magnesium wouldn't solve, fatigue that creatine wouldn't touch. He increased the intensity of the protocols. The collapse accelerated. He came to me in desperation. The first thing I asked, what do you consider unacceptable in yourself? He looked at me like I'd spoken in an alien language. After 20 minutes, he admitted it. He felt envy towards a co-founder who was naturally charismatic. He felt anger towards his mother for the pressure she put on him during childhood. He felt fear of failing publicly, and he had suppressed all of this with optimization protocols. Dopamine to mask envy, cold plunges to suppress anger, extreme exercise to escape fear. For 18 months it worked, until his prefrontal cortex entered regulatory fatigue, and it all emerged at once, detonating relationships and performance. I introduced the hybrid protocol. We maintained the Huberman protocols, but we added daily active imagination, nightly journaling, weekly shadow self-audits. The first 2 weeks were intense. He confronted aspects of himself he had denied for decades, but something changed. The anger didn't disappear. It transformed into healthy boundaries. The envy didn't vanish. It became motivation to develop his own strengths. The fear wasn't eliminated. It became strategic planning. And the Huberman protocols? They started working again. Because now they were working with an integrated system, not against a system at internal war. After 12 weeks, performance was 40% above his previous peak. But the difference wasn't productivity, it was sustainability. Because here's the truth no one talks about. You can optimize for a sprint, or you can integrate for a marathon. Protocols alone are a sprint, intense, effective, unsustainable. Protocols with real depth, they're a marathon, not a sprint. Gradual, compound, unbreakable. Carl Jung chose the marathon. He spent 6 years in psychological hell and emerged with his sanity intact and a theoretical framework that would last for centuries. Andrew Huberman is learning that marathon now. He's quietly adding practices of depth to his protocols. He doesn't talk about it much, because it doesn't fit the narrative of total control. But it's definitely there. There are more stories that need to be told, because the pattern is always the same, and the more you recognize the pattern, the less power it has over you. Take Sarah, 29, a competitive CrossFit athlete. She'd been following Huberman's protocols for 2 years. Supplementation timed down to the minute, perfect eating windows, scientifically periodized training, optimized recovery. She was a machine, until she started waking up with panic attacks for no apparent reason. Morning cortisol was normal on blood tests, controlled dopamine release, thyroid perect, but the attacks intensified. She added more meditation, more breathwork, more cold exposure to regulate her nervous system. The attacks got worse. When we talked, one thing became clear. Sarah had built her entire identity on being strong. Weakness was unacceptable. Vulnerability was a failure. Fear was shame. She suppressed any sign of fragility with more training, more intensity, more control, and it worked. Until it didn't. Anymore, the fear she denied found the only outlet available: nighttime panic attacks when her prefrontal cortex was at rest and could no longer suppress it. We introduced a hybrid protocol. She resisted initially. The idea of confronting weakness contradicted everything she'd built, but she was desperate. Her first active imagination session was devastating. When she allowed images to arise without control, a child appeared, scared, alone, saying she couldn't be strong anymore. Sarah wanted to run from the image, suppress it, return to control. But I said, stay, dialogue, ask what she needs. Sarah asked, and the child responded with something that changed everything. I don't need you to be strong all the time. I need you to recognize that I exist, that feeling afraid is human, that weakness isn't a failure. It's part of being complete. That night, Sarah cried for the first time in 5 years, and the panic attacks, they stopped in 3 weeks, not because she got stronger, but because she stopped the internal war between forced strength and denied weakness. Or consider Marcus, 41 years old, an investment banking executive. He'd been following performance protocols for 3 years, nootropics, red light therapy, sauna, ice baths, sleep optimized with 12 supplements. Productivity was his religion. And then he started to self-sabotage. He'd forget important meetings, procrastinate on critical projects, miss deadlines he'd never miss. He didn't understand. He had all the tools, all the discipline, all the optimization, but he was inexplicably self-sabotaging. He increased his dosages of nootropics, added more protocols. The sabotage intensified. When we explored his shadow self, we found something surprising. Marcus hated what he did, deeply. But he never admitted it, because financial success was his identity. It was how his family saw him, how he saw himself. So he suppressed the hatred with productivity, more efficiency, more optimization, more control. And the shadow self, that part of him that hated living like this, found the only way to be heard: sabotage, strategic forgetfulness, procrastination on projects. That advanced a career he hated. It wasn't a lack of discipline, it was the shadow self trying to protect him from a life his public persona had built. But his deeper self rejected. Integrating this was brutal, because it meant admitting that 15 years of his career might have been a mistake. But when Marcus confronted this truth in active imagination, something unexpected happened. The shadow self didn't tell him to quit everything and become a surfer. It said something more subtle. You can stay in the bank, but stop pretending you love it. Recognize that you do it for security, for your family, for stability, and find something you really love, even if it's just a hobby, even if it's just 2 hours a week. Stop suppressing the hate. Integrate it as motivation to build an exit strategy in the long term. Marcus started writing, something he loved but considered unproductive. 2 hours on Saturdays, no goals, no optimization, pure expression. And the sabotage, it disappeared. Because the shadow self didn't need to sabotage anymore to be heard. It was being integrated consciously. These cases reveal something crucial. The shadow self isn't the enemy. It's a signal. It shows you where you're living a lie, where your public persona diverges from your deeper self, where optimization has become a prison. And when you suppress the signals, it doesn't give up. It escalates: irritability, unexplained fatigue, panic attacks, sabotage, collapse, not because you're weak, but because you're an integrated system being forced to function in a fragmented way. And fragmented systems eventually collapse. Not by failure, by design. Neuroscience has a term for this: allostatic overload. It's when the body spends more energy maintaining homeostasis than energy is available. Eventually, it enters systemic collapse. But Jungian psychology understood this 100 years before neuroscience. Jung called it neurosis. It's when the psychic energy spent suppressing the shadow self exceeds the energy available. Eventually, it enters psychological collapse. Optimization protocols without integration accelerate this because they increase the demand on the prefrontal cortex to suppress more, control more, optimize more. And when the system enters allostatic overload neurobiologically and Jungian neurosis simultaneously, you don't have collapse, you have destruction. And you? Are you running a sprint thinking it's a marathon? And when you collapse, are you going to think it's a lack of discipline? Are you going to think you need a more intense protocol? Are you going to add more suppression and accelerate the collapse? Unless you do what Jung did, what Huberman is doing in private, confront the shadow self before it confronts you, integrate before you collapse. Because here's the final paradox. Optimization protocols are essential, but they carry within them the mechanism of self-destruction, not because they're flawed, but because they're incomplete. Controlled dopamine release is essential, but it doesn't touch why you seek dopamine compulsively. Cold plunges regulate the nervous system, but they don't. Resolve the repressed anger that's constantly dysregulating it. Exercise builds physical resilience, but it doesn't integrate the fear that corrodes psychological resilience. You need both, optimization and integration, Huberman and Jung, neuroscience and depth, protocols and the shadow self. And when you have both, you don't stop collapsing. You stop having the internal fracture that causes collapse. There's a concept in Jungian psychology called conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites. It's the ultimate goal of individuation, integrating contradictory aspects of the self into a coherent totality: public persona and shadow self, control and spontaneity, optimization and acceptance, strength and vulnerability. Modern neuroscience is discovering that this isn't just poetry. It's directed neuroplasticity. It's the brain's capacity to forge new connections between regions that typically inhibit each other. And when that happens, you don't have to choose between performance and profound understanding. You get both. Composite. Carl Jung drew the map. Andrew Huberman is translating it into neurobiological GPS. You don't need to choose. You need to integrate. And integration starts with a simple but brutal admission. You're not just the optimized public persona you present to the world. You're also the denied shadow self, working 24/7 to sabotage your protocols. And as long as you deny that, every protocol you follow will have an expiration date. Not because protocols are bad, but because you're trying to build a cathedral on cracked ground. The foundation will give way. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. But here's the promise. When you do the work, when you confront, when you integrate, when you unite Huberman and Jung, optimization and depth, protocols and shadow self, you don't build temporary performance. You build anti-fragile psychological structure. That doesn't just survive stress, it grows with it. That doesn't collapse under pressure, it strengthens with it. Not because you've become invulnerable, but because you've become integrated. And integration isn't the absence of conflict. It's the ability to contain conflict without fragmenting. So here's your choice. You can keep following optimization protocols, ignoring your shadow self. It'll work for 90 to 180 days. Then you'll collapse. You'll think it's a character flaw. You'll try again with even more intensity. You'll collapse even faster, and you'll enter the cycle that destroys biohackers, elite athletes, and CEOs every year. Or you can do what Jung did in 1913, what Huberman is doing in private, what neuroscience is proving. You can integrate before you collapse, confront the shadow self, before it takes down your protocols, unite optimization and depth, before the internal fracture becomes irreparable. The science Jung predicted is here. 80 years later, validated by neuroimaging, confirmed by longitudinal studies, replicated in elite labs. The shadow self isn't a metaphor. It's suppressed neurobiology. And your optimization protocols don't fail because of a lack of discipline. They carry the mechanism of self-destruction within them because you're optimizing half a brain. But now you know. You know about the buried study, the hybrid protocol, the necessary union. You know you have a choice, sprint or marathon, collapse or integration, fragmentation or wholeness, Huberman alone or Huberman plus Jung. So, what's it going to be? Are you going to keep running on a protocol that has an expiration date? Or are you going to do the work of integration that Jung mapped and Huberman validates in private? Because the clock is ticking. Not because I say so, because your prefrontal cortex has a metabolic limit and your shadow self has infinite patience. It can wait for you to optimize everything perfectly, build the impeccable public persona, achieve peak performance, and then, when you're at the top, when you have the most to lose, it will emerge, not out of malice, out of neurobiological necessity, because integration isn't optional, it's inevitable. The only choice you have is whether you'll integrate consciously, with protocol, with structure, or if you'll integrate through collapse. Jung chose consciously, almost went insane, but emerged integrated. Huberman is choosing consciously, adds depth to the protocols, doesn't talk about it because it doesn't sell, but does it because it works. And you're at the point of choice, the moment when this video can change your trajectory. Not because I have magic answers, but because now you see the fracture. You see that protocols without depth are a neurobiological time bomb. You see that your shadow self isn't the enemy, it's half of you, begging for integration. And you see that you have a protocol, hybrid, tested, validated, waiting. Here's what I do. Active imagination, 20 minutes every afternoon, journaling 10 minutes every night, shadow self audit every week, along with timed sunlight exposure, cold plunge, exercise, supplementation, Huberman and Jung, optimization and integration, protocols and depth. It's not easy. Confronting denied aspects never is, but it's sustainable. And sustainability, composited over decades, destroys unsustainable performance, composited over months. The choice is yours, but the clock is ticking, and the shadow self is waiting, not with malice, with neurobiological inevitability. It will emerge. The question is, will you be ready when it comes, or will it destroy you when it comes? This knowledge isn't common. This connection between Jung and Huberman isn't obvious. It takes hundreds of hours, reading buried studies, connecting neuroscience with depth psychology, testing protocols, validating in real-world cases, Most channels don't do this because it doesn't sell, because people want quick hacks, simple protocols, 30-day solutions. But you've made it this far, which means you're not the majority. You see that real performance requires real depth. If this work is worth anything to you, if this revelation has changed how you see your protocols, consider the super thanks. It's not just financial support. It's you saying, keep revealing what they're hiding, keep uniting optimization and depth, keep showing that sustainable performance requires shadow self-integration. Every super thanks funds the next revelation, the next connection between neuroscience and depth psychology that no one else is making. The truth about optimization protocols is uncomfortable. They work, but they have a neurobiological expiration date. And when that date expires, you don't just return to baseline, you collapse below it, unless you do what few do, integrate the shadow self while optimizing the public persona. Unite Jung and Huberman, depth and protocols, because in the end, it's not optimization or integration, it's optimization and integration, or it's collapse. Have you ever felt like you're doing everything right, but there's still something wrong, that you've optimized everything, but the emptiness remains, that you followed protocols perfectly, but the internal sabotage continues? That's not a failure. That's the shadow self begging for integration. And now you know you have a protocol, you have structure, you have science. Comments are open. Which Huberman protocol have you mastered that still left you empty? What aspect of the shadow self do you realize you're suppressing? Where do you recognize the pattern of optimization followed by collapse? Share it, because when you name the shadow self, you start the integration. And integration is where temporary performance transforms into anti-fragile structure.